Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Maurice Samuels, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the last talk in this year's Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series. Today's speaker, David de Jong, is a correspondent in the Middle East, where he writes for the Dutch Financial Daily, among other publications. For the research and writing of Nazi billionaires, he reported from Berlin for 4 years. Before that, de Jong was a reporter at Bloomberg News in New York, where he wrote about hidden wealth, and in Amsterdam, where he wrote about European banking and finance. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg Business Week. De Jong was born and raised in Amsterdam and currently lives in Tel Aviv. Nazi Billionaires is his first book. And many of you probably saw his really fantastic, hard-hitting op-ed in the New York Times last week. So hopefully we'll have time to discuss that as well. So a word first about how things will work today. David will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We won't be able to see or hear you, but you can submit questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A function, and I will relay them to David. So without further ado, it's really a great pleasure to see David again, who I got to know a little bit in Berlin last year, and really excited to hear more about this book, which I've just been reading, and I have to say is just a fantastic read. In addition to being about completely fascinating subject matter, it's really well written. It reads like a novel, so I highly recommend it to everyone. All right, now I will hand it over to David.
Thank you so much, Maury, for that kind introduction. I am going to be talking about the families in my book, who I think, the 5 families I write about in my book, who I think very well represents, or their patriarchs at least, very well represent this kind of German big business, or at least an overview of German big business, because these families were then, and are still today, Germany's most prominent business dynasties. And I want to start it off with, I'm going to try and condense a century from 1919 to 2019 in about 40 minutes. So I'll be zigzagging through the 5 families. But I'll start off with the main family, the Quandt dynasty, whose heirs today control BMW, or at least 2 of the heirs. It's still Germany's wealthiest family today. And their patriarch, Gunther Quandt, loses his wife, Antonia, in the Spanish flu of 1918. And in the spring of 1919, he takes a night train from Berlin to Kassel in the center of Germany. And he meets she's not even a woman yet, she's a girl, a 17-year-old girl, called Magda Friedlander. Magda Friedlander, who just came out of a relationship with a Jewish student named Chaim Arlozorov, who later becomes a very well-known Zionist in Israel, and is shot dead under very mysterious circumstances in 1933 on the beach of Tel Aviv. She comes out of a relationship with Arlozorov when she takes that night train in the Easter weekend of 1919, and she meets Gunther Quandt. Magda Friedlander her stepfather is Jewish, and she's taken on his last name, Richard Friedlander. But she was baptized Catholic and raised Catholic, and she meets Gunther Quandt, and they go and Gunther Quandt, who's 20 years older than she is completely enamored with her. And when Magda gets out at her stop in central Germany and goes to the boarding school where she is, he finds her address, and he writes to her that very night when he arrives at his destination. and he takes her out on a date, and within 3 dates he proposes to her. Gunther has 2 sons from his first marriage, and he proposes to her, and she, after some consideration, she says yes, and they get married, or she says yes and they get engaged. Now, however, to get married, he has one condition. Gunther Quandt has one condition, or 2 conditions: that she reconverts from Catholicism back to Protestantism, which is he is Lutheran, and secondly, that she drops the name Friedlander before she gets married, and that she reassumes her birth name, Ritschl, which was her biological father's name, because, of course, from his perspective, he could never get married, or Gunther Quandt could never get married to a woman who holds a Jewish last name. And I think that is very much that episode where my book starts with, is very much emblematic for the thinking of the families, or at least the patriarchs of the families I'm writing about. This latent anti-Semitism, as opposed to the really racial anti-Semitism, this convinced anti-Semitism. These men I write about are not convinced anti-Semites. They are, for the most part, Protestants who, very much in Lutheran theology, is from my view, deeply anti-Semitic. Also, many voters who voted in the Nazi party, there was a far higher votes for the NSDAP in the more Protestant parts of Germany, who saw Hitler really as a sort of reincarnation, to many, of Martin Luther. So it is really this latent anti-Semitism that is prevalent not only in the circles of big business, but I would say, unfortunately, for the most part of Christian German society, both Protestant and Catholic, at that time. Now, Gunther Quandt, who's already from a very wealthy family, a textile family, builds up this empire during the era of hyperinflation, as does his fellow industrialist, Friedrich Flick, who ends up being probably Germany's most notorious industrialist of the 20th century, and who is eventually convicted, the only one of my main characters, who's eventually convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The 2 of them separately start very much profiting from the era of hyperinflation in the 1920s. Gunther Quandt manages through hyperinflation, which wiped out most of the middle classes, but for the speculators of that time, the stock speculators of the time, was a very profitable era. Managed to take control of a global battery factory, AFA, and a global or a weapons factory or weapons firm called DWM. And that is really the groundwork of the Quandt business empire that they very much profit from after Hitler seizes power in 1933. Now, as for Friedrich Flick, he parlays a steel company that he controls into a steel conglomerate. He takes over the United Steelworks during the hyperinflation era, and it is very interesting to see how virulent anti-Semitism is already leveled against the kind of the Jewish speculators of the great Jewish speculators of that era. In Germany, where there is this idea of, they're just speculating, they're accumulating stocks, and they're accumulating controlling interests in companies, across the board of the business spectrum, from industry to textiles, to battery, to weapons. But these same accusations, which you still see today leveled against George Soros or the conspiracy theorists do, you don't see them leveled against Gunther Quandt and Friedrich Flick being, Protestant parts of the German establishment. Now I want to go to 1933 and Hitler seizing power in Germany. The quickly codifying of anti-Semitic laws in Germany, quickly see the main characters in my book taking advantage of it. Gunther Quandt gets briefly detained because at this point in time, his marriage to Magda Quandt has dissolved, and Magda Quandt has on to become Magda Goebbels. She divorces Gunther Quandt in 1929 and soon meets Joseph Goebbels, who is then the Reichspropagandaleiter for Berlin, and is up and coming in the then still burgeoning Nazi party, and they soon become the most prominent couple of the Third Reich, and a custody battle ensues. Gunther Quandt has two sons from his first marriage, Herbert and Helmut, and has one son together with Magda called Harold. And a custody battle about Harold ensues, and he is arrested, which he later purports is on Goebbels' orders. He's arrested on May 4th, 1933, 3 days after Gunther Quandt becomes a member of the Nazi party. He spent 6 weeks in custody, and then as soon as he gets out and he first has to go into house arrest, he starts firing the Jewish members of his supervisory boards and executive boards. He starts removing them from his company boards. Even though he says, he later purports himself to be a victim of Goebbels and a victim of the Nazi regime, and as an opponent, even though he becomes one of the Third Reich's largest profiteers, and he quickly takes advantage of business partners that he had. There was a banker named Jacob Goldsmith, which both Friedrich Flick and Gunther Quandt did a lot of business with, and was served on their company boards. He is, by both Quandt and Flick, is swiftly removed from their boards, and is forced to flee Nazi Germany. And that is, again, emblematic also of the thinking of these men. They are not convinced anti-Semites, but they are willing to play along with the regime, with the Nazi regime, as long as it benefits their companies, their fortunes, and they will not do anything that goes against the rules, by going the extra mile to save their Jewish colleagues or employees from persecution. Now, following the implementation of the Nuremberg race laws in mid-September 1935, where, of course, the disenfranchisement of Jewish citizens in Nazi Germany really ramps up, you see this concept of Arya, which later became known as Aryanization, really enter into the discourse for German businessmen. And the concept of Aryanization was this idea of the removal of the Jewish element from the ownership of an asset, whether that was a Jewish-owned company, shares, jewelry, art, real estate. That's where it starts. And of course, initially, these transactions still have the veneer of a regular business transaction between, I would say, 1935 to 1937. But they very soon afterwards become the outright expropriation and appropriation by the Nazi regime, as well as the businessmen I'm writing about. I mean, I give countless examples in my book of Aryanization, but I will give several, and the most prominent one I want to start with is the removal of Adolf Rosenberger, the co-founder of Porsche, of the Porsche company, by his two, or the buyout is the correct term, of Adolf Rosenberger by his two Porsche company co-founders, Anton Piëch and Ferdinand Porsche. The three of them start the car design company in 1930 in Stuttgart. And they, on the day that Adolf Rosenberger resigns in January 1933, 30th of January 1933, is also the day that Adolf Hitler seizes power in Germany. He resigns, Rosenberger, because he is fed up with he's the commercial director of Porsche, and he's fed up with, being the financial backer of the Porsche company, which is blowing through money on the expensive designs of Ferdinand Porsche, the mercurial car designer, and whose company, it's a namesake company, but Adolf Rosenberger has 10% of the shares. He stays on, Adolf Rosenberger, as a Porsche shareholder until July 1935, when he's bought out of the Porsche company at the nominal value of his shares, which was 3,000 Reichsmark. Now, at this point in time, Ferdinand Porsche has convinced Hitler to put his design, the Volkswagen, into production, while the Porsche company was verging on bankruptcy on January 30th, 1933. By the time July 1935 comes around, it is a very profitable company. However, Adolf Rosenberger is bought out for the nominal value of his shares, 3,000 Reichsmark, which is far below the market value of his actual shares. And that is, again, that is a stereotypical form of Aryanization, the way these transactions were conducted. They wanted to remove, Piëch and Porsche wanted to remove Adolf Rosenberger as a shareholder, which Adolf Rosenberger later contends is because they wanted to have a classification as a company which was free of Jews. And Adolf Rosenberger, who is ready to leave Germany. He actually is then soon after he gets bought out of Porsche, detained in a concentration camp on the charge of racial defilement, and is helped by his successor as commercial director, helps him to be freed from the concentration camp. Porsche and Piëch don't do anything to help their co-founder out. And later a whole legal battle ensues. And the other families in my book, Quandt as well, greatly profits from Aryanization. He acquires the companies he acquires several battery companies owned by German Jews, far below the market value of their shares. And Friedrich Flick actually becomes the largest profiteer or at least the largest privately, of the private businessmen, he becomes the largest profiteer of Aryanization. He takes over the massive pet shack brown coal conglomerates in central Germany. In one for $6 million, also far below the market value of the shares of one branch of the pet shack dynasty, and the other one is outright expropriated by the Nazi regime, and he then ends up in a asset swap with those brown coal assets as well. Another, the fourth family I write about in the book, it's August von Fink. And August von Fink, I write about both senior and junior. They is a co-founding financiers family of Allianz and Munich Re. Today, two of the world's largest insurers and reinsurers. And August von Fink Sr., his father, who co-founded Allianz and Munich Re, his father dies when he is 25, and he inherits these, the largest stakes in these insurance companies, as well as a controlling stake in the family's private bank, Merck Fink. And Hitler asks him in 1933, because he is, as Nazi officials call him, Bavaria's wealthiest and stingiest man. He asks him if von Fink can fundraise, as he refuses to spend any money of himself, on if he can fundraise for the House of German Art, which is Hitler's pet project, a new museum on the southern border of the English Garden in Munich. And von Fink readily says yes, and is happy to and ends up fundraising 20 million Reichsmark from his fellow tycoons and financiers for the building of that museum, which today is still a very prominent building in Munich. And as a thank you for his successful fundraising efforts, von Fink is rewarded by being allowed to Aryanize the Rothschild Bank, which is the Austrian branch, which is Austria's largest private bank, and the Austrian branch of the Rothschild family. And he is also allowed to Aryanize in Berlin the Dreyfus Bank branch. And he first does so by, the museum opens in 1937, and he uses also the laws of Nazi Germany in a way also of attacking, not only of Aryanizing these private banks, which expands his business empire significantly, but also by attacking his fellow private bankers, which was greatly dominated by there were a lot of private banks at the time owned by Jews, many who had been around for generations. He utilizes the anti-Semitism in vigorously attacking fellow private bankers, and so successfully that his attacks and then his subsequent Aryanizations cause a kind of a bank run on other Jewish-owned private banks, and it is it forms kind of the blueprint for the, as they called it, de-Jewification of Germany's Germany's private banking system. And August von Fink becomes the largest profiteer in Nazi Germany of private banking Aryanizations. The last example I want to provide of the families that I write about is the Oetker-Kaselowski family. Richard Kaselowski is the CEO of Dr. Oetker, a large baking goods conglomerate, who is mentoring his stepson Rudolf August Oetker to take over as CEO of the Dr. Oetker pudding empire. This is mainly a European-based conglomerate still today, very well known for its frozen pizzas and its pudding mixes. And Richard Kazalowski is actually one of the few men who is like an ideological National Socialist. He is really convinced, he's a convinced Nazi. The other examples that I gave of the other industrialists and financiers are, for the most part, are opportunists who leverage anti-Semitism and the laws of Nazi Germany to their business advantage. Whereas Richard Kazalowski is such a convinced National Socialist that he actually, it's to the detriment of Dr. Oetker's business, because they own, for instance, not only a baked goods company, but they also own a publishing company, and they merge on Kazalowski's instigation, they merge a very highly profitable newspaper that they have with a Nazi publication that is bleeding money. And his stepson, Rudolf August Oetker, who ends up voluntarily applying and joining the Waffen-SS, at one point he goes to Hamburg. He's 21 years old in 1937, and he acquires the house of a Jewish executive who fled to Australia. And it's actually the only time in the book where Kazalowski warns his stepson, who he mentors. He says, be aware, to this house, steers stick to this house. I mean, I cite it in the book. And it is quite confounding that the only kind of sense of remorse or a sense of forewarning in the context of an Aryanization I found was of somebody who was an ideological Nazi. He wasn't so much, again, he was also a latent, I use the word latent anti-Semite. He was not a racial anti-Semite. Kazalowski also had many Jewish business partners, who, of course, he swiftly cut ties with following 1933. But it is the only instance I came across during my research, and that of the one ideological Nazi, where he warns his stepson of what he is about to do with the Aryanization, that, of the moral implications that there are. Of course, his stepson, Rudolf August Oetker, who became one of Germany's most prominent post-war industrialists, shrugs himself and buys the house of the fled tobacco executive far under the market value of his shares. So these are really the bulk of the examples in the Aryanization period. I want to move over to the post-war period, where Friedrich Flick stands on trial in 1947 in the Nuremberg Trial that is led by, it's a subsequent Nuremberg Trials. Of course, you have the main Nuremberg Trial, where 24 of Nazi Germany's most high-profile politicians and military leaders were indicted and convicted. But under the American purview, you have 12 subsequent trials, and the Flick trial is one of them. Friedrich Flick is indicted and convicted on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the trial is led by the prosecutor general, whose name is Telford Taylor, and he says in his opening statement, "The defendants will tell you that they were not anti-Semitic and even protected individual Jews against the Nazis. Yet it was not beneath them to appear in public with and pay a king's ransom to Himmler," the SS leader, Heinrich Himmler, "who all but rendered the Jews extinct in Europe. They fattened on the misfortunes of wealthy Jews," etc., etc. And Friedrich Flick, in his defense, says, well, I'm actually exactly what Telford Taylor says in his opening statement. Friedrich Flick uses the defense. Well, actually, I was a protector of all Jews, even though he was the largest profiteer of Aryanizations in the Third Reich. He says, I protected the Jewish businessmen whose companies I acquired, and in order not to have the suspicion fall on me, I sometimes also made a casual anti-Semitic remark during the Aryanizations. In many of the memos, you find some of his very offhand anti-Semitic remarks, and he said I did that in order to not be too suspicious, and not to have the suspicion land on me that I was a supporter of the Jews, which of course is a completely inverted reality, a perversion of reality. I want to give two more examples. I want to go to the late 1970s, in which Ferry Porsche, the son of Ferdinand Porsche, and the man who receives out of Rosenberger's shares after his father and his brother-in-law buy Rosenberger out of the Porsche company in 1935. In 1976, Ferry Porsche, who designed the first Porsche sports car, was also a voluntary SS officer, voluntarily applied to the SS in 1938, entered the SS, or was admitted to the SS in 1941, and ends up surrounding himself with high-ranking former SS officers at the Porsche company, of course, then a global sports icon in the 1950s and 60s. In 1967, in his first autobiography, which is solely published in the United States by Doubleday at the time, it's called We at Porsche. For the Porsche sports company, the American market is the most important market. He has no trouble at all spewing virulent anti-Semitic vitriol about Adolf Rosenberger, who he accused of extorting him and his father and his brother-in-law and the Porsche company after the war ends, and Rosenberger tries to get compensated for being bought out of the Porsche company far under market value of his shares. So, and he writes the following. I want to read that part as well. Almost a decade after Rosenberger's death, Ferry published his first autobiography, We at Porsche. In it, the sports car designer not only twisted the truth of Rosenberger's Aryanization and escape from Nazi Germany, but also did the same with the stories of other German Jews who were forced to sell their firms and flee Hitler's regime. Ferry even accused Rosenberger of extortion after the war. What's more, the former SS officer used blatant anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudice in his warped account. After the war, it seemed as though those people who had been persecuted by the Nazis considered it their right to make an additional profit, even in cases where they had already been compensated. Rosenberger was by no means an isolated example, Ferry writes. Ferry, now in his mid-60s, supplied an example of a Jewish family who had voluntarily sold their factory after leaving Nazi Germany for Mussolini's Italy, only to return after the war and claim payment a second time, at least according to his interpretation of events. Ferry continued, it would be hard to blame the Rosenberger for thinking in a like manner. He no doubt felt that since he was Jewish and had been forced out of Germany by the Nazis who had done so much harm, he was entitled to an extra profit. So that latent anti-Semitism that, and this is quite explicit, that I referred to earlier to those patriarchs and those industrialists in the Weimar Republic in Nazi Germany, this thinking for many continued unabatedly in the post-war era in the and in West Germany, without any ceasing. I mean, the fact that Ferry Porsche felt so confident to write this down in English in his very publicly published first autobiography goes to show how common and widespread this casual use of anti-Semitic remark that he dared to put it in such a public, in his first autobiography, which was first published in English and only later, 2 years later, 4 years later, published in German. But to give an indication of that thinking today, I wanted to conclude on by giving the example of August von Fink Jr., who is the son of August von Fink Sr. August von Fink Jr. died this November, November 2021, in London at the age of 91. He became, after his father died, one of Germany's most secretive and most successful investors, and somebody who started funding German conservative, right-wing, and ultimately far-right causes. And he did that over a three-decade period, starting in the 1990s and ending, or at least to what it has become known to the public, ending in the late aughts, around 2017. And he worked together, his right-hand man, a man named Ernst Knut Stahl, was kind of his money man, and the man who would serve as a conduit between August von Fink Jr.'s political spending and the anti-EU, anti-Euro, libertarian, conservative or free market liberal causes he would donate to. And at one point there is a lunch, and this happens in May of 2017 in Munich. There is a lunch it happens in Munich. There's a lunch that Ernst Knut Stahl has with a publisher. He's trying to recruit a publisher for a new right-wing publication or far-right publication in Germany. And he says, reportedly at that meeting, he says, "There's danger ahead," von Fink Jr.'s lieutenant said at the meeting. "There's a street in New York with lots of investment bankers, lawyers, and so forth. Coincidentally, they are all Jews, but that's not relevant here. They want to push Germany into ruin. They control everything," says Ernst Knut Stahl during a May 2017 lunch meeting in Munich. To give you an example of how, this is a prominent businessman, and he's the right-hand man to one of Germany's wealthiest and most prolific political spenders over the past couple of decades. To give you just one indication of, unfortunately, how prevalent this thinking and saying still is. So I would like to conclude it on that note. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, David. And there's really, I think, a lot to dig into here. And I urge everybody to please submit questions. Again, excuse me, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will filter them to David. But I have a lot of questions of my own. So first of all, if you could just start by saying, what was your most kind of surprising discovery doing this research? I imagine, as you make clear, some of this was known already, at least in certain ways, but some wasn't. So like, what to you was your biggest find?
I think actually the Adolf Rosenberger storyline, which I added latest to the book, it was actually, my partner pointed out to me a documentary that was broadcast on German television in summer of 2019, which brings up the fact that Adolf Rosenberger was completely erased from Porsche company history, and the fact that Porsche, such a global icon, such a global brand, had a Jewish co-founder who was not only bought out far below the market value of his shares, but was also just completely erased from company history. And it actually turned out, to me, that was the biggest surprise on a micro level of stories. But I think on a macro level, in a bigger picture, I think, and that also was the reason why I started writing the book in the first place, was the fact how, brazen the whitewashing today still is by companies like Porsche and BMW, where they have all these, global foundations in the name of Ferry Porsche and Herbert Quandt, who saved BMW from 1959, celebrating their business successes, but leaving out, any part of the war crimes they committed or the Nazi affiliations that they had. And, after these families and these companies purported to have reckoned with their Third Reich, with their Nazi era histories and activities. And I think that, especially in this day and age, and I got this idea for the book back in 2014, and it didn't change. It's 8 years. I mean, they had 8 years to come clean about it, but luckily for me, they didn't, because I could. But I thought every day it was going to be like they're going
scooped.
to.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to get scooped. I'm going to get front run on this news.
Okay, so as I was reading the book, I had a running dialogue with myself, like, well, which are the worst? I kept kind of going back and forth. And clearly there are kind of varying degrees of guilt, but I'm wondering if you had a thought about which one you thought was the worst.
Well, I do think the Quandt, or at least the two Quandt siblings that today could. Well, are you talking about the patriarchs or the entire families? Or
both. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of patriarchs, I think I can't really distinguish. I think they were all equally awful in a sense. But I do think that those families today that control, the families like the Quandts or the BMW, or the siblings that control BMW today, the Quandt siblings that control BMW today, as well as the Porsche Pierre clan and the Porsche more to an extent, that control Porsche, but not only Porsche, but also Volkswagen, Audi, Bentley, Lamborghini, etc. And that have these outward-facing foundations and corporate headquarters and even media prizes named after these men without being transparent. I think they are the most blatant in the cover-up of the history. And I think also because they control such global brands and have such global outward-facing companies, they also have a bigger responsibility to be transparent about the history, in my opinion.
So a question from the audience. Could you say a little bit about what conditions were like in some of the factories that Jews had to work as slave laborers in?
This very much differed. I mean, and there were also, for the most part, Jewish or slave labor done by Jews who were kept in concentration camps who were not sent to extermination camps, right? Because that's the distinguish we're talking about here at this point. They were kept in sub-concentration camps, or they were deported from concentration camps to the factory complexes at Volkswagen or at Gunther Quandt and Herbert Quandt's battery factories, and they were kept in the most. There were, I know, at Quandt's AFA factory outside of Hanover, there was a gallows. There were abusive capos who beat prisoners sometimes to death. I mean, it ranged. I mean, there were on the lowest bottom of the rung were the Jewish slave laborers, followed by mainly Slavic forced and slave laborers, millions who were deported from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, and other Eastern European countries. And Western Europeans, for the most part, were comparatively treated much better. I mean, yeah. I mean,
which wasn't even
yes,
it's
exactly.
still pretty
Exactly.
bad, but yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So, okay, another question. Can you give examples of big German firms or individuals that refused to collaborate with the Nazi regime? So did I imagine some refused maybe to actively profit from Aryanization, but can you give any positive examples here?
I mean, there's the example of Robert Bosch, who was this very well-known industrialist, and the company that he left behind, Bosch, which is owned by a foundation, not owned by a family anymore. The company he left behind, is still one of the world's is a massive is a massive electrotechnical conglomerate today, and he was a very progressive industrialist. Really took care of the labor conditions for his employees. Already going back to the Kaiserreich and the Weimar Republic, and he was very much anti-Hitler. And even he, and he supported through his right-hand man, funded the resistance to the extent he could. I mean, he died in 1942. Robert Bosch did, and he, but even he mass-produced weapons for the Third Reich, and and forced labor was used in his company. So, and he would say he's one of the positive examples. I mean. That's the most positive example I can give. Across the board, forced and to a lesser extent slave labor was used by German business.
Yeah.
And Aryanizations occurred. This was a business decision, right? This was a capital. So it occurred only if they made sense. These businessmen didn't make Aryanization acquisition if it didn't make sense for their business expansion. So these were all business deliberations that they made. Does this asset make sense? Can we get it for the right price? These were called calculating decisions.
Yeah.
So for instance, mass conglomerates who didn't do any Aryanizations, it doesn't mean that that says something about that they were any better than Gunther Quandt or Friedrich Flick, who did. It was just that it didn't make sense. Such acquisitions didn't make sense in their overall, in their M&A strategy, in their corporate development strategy,
Okay, I'm feeling a little bit better about my dishwasher, but a little bit worse about my coffee maker now. So,
right.
So question about what the Allies did to push for punishment of these, firms or wealthy Germans after the war. Was there any effort of the occupying Allied, as part of the denazification process?
Initially it starts with the Morgenthau Plan. Robert Morgenthau Jr. was the Treasury Secretary, proposes the Morgenthau Plan, which basically called for the entire dismantling of Germany's industry and the summarily execution, not just of political and military leaders, but also of business leaders. That plan is scrapped, and instead you have this plan that is mainly drawn up by John J. McCloy and his boss Stinson in the War Department, who also we can talk about the anti-Semitism of German big business, but of course it was rife in the American State Department and War Department too. And they come up with this plan which envisions the Nuremberg Trials, oversees the occupation and the dividing of an occupied Germany between the United States and the United Kingdom, and also oversees the as they called it, which was part of the 4Ds. Denazification was one of them, but so was decartelization and deconcentration of German industry, which in the end doesn't really happen to a large extent. It's only IG Farben is a very prominent example of, at the time, the largest chemicals and pharmaceuticals conglomerate in the world, split up in what is today BASF and Bayer, still two of the largest companies in the world in pharmaceuticals and chemicals, respectively. But for the most part, of course, the Cold War emerges, and initially Harry Truman and then Ike Eisenhower, but particularly Truman, makes the policy decision that the United States government needs a viable, democratic, or economically viable and democratic West Germany as a bulwark against an encroaching Soviet Union. Yeah. And all the aspirations and ambitions that they had for the reform of German society and denazification, it all quickly goes out the window. And the overarching aim becomes the buildup of West German society as a democratic and a capitalist state. Yeah.
So some people are asking, you really focus on kind of heavy industry, I would say, in the book, but you clearly could have talked about, someone raised the question of like the entertainment business, and I imagine that there were kind of similar stories going on in all different aspects of, all different areas of the German economy. Is that true, would you say, or?
Well, listen, I mean, I picked the families. I picked the business families of those that are still most relevant today in German, European, and global business. So that it could have, I think, in a sense, the businesses that I chose, and I think that's why they're also so emblematic or so exemplary of the larger, wider business community and their thoughts, is because they do range. I mean, sure, Gunther Quandt, Friedrich Flick, big industry, but one would say, Porsche Pierre car, and then of course the von Fink is in finance, and the Oetkers are in consumer goods at that time, right? So it does give, the two main characters are indeed in heavy industry, but I wanted to focus on those families that are relevant today. So regardless of what industries they were in at the time of the Nazi era.
Yeah, and your opening kind of scene where these rich Germans are summoned to a meeting with Hitler is incredibly chilling. Where like there's a lot, how are they going to react, and they are more than willing to help finance his. So here, a bunch of people have put forward a really interesting question that I had too, which is, you end the book on a maybe hopeful note saying, we will do better.
Right.
But a lot of people are asking what that would look like. So what do you hope your book accomplishes? What kind of reckoning are you hoping for?
I mean, this book? At the bare minimum is this, and that's also the idea I went into. I mean, the book is an argument in favor of historical transparency. And I think at the bare minimum, these families should be, with the massive consumer brands that they control, should be outwardly transparent about the histories of the vaunted patriarchs that they call their foundations and global headquarters and brands and media prizes after. I mean, I think that is a bare minimum that we can expect. And if they don't want to do that, then I think they should rename. They should rename. That is what a reckoning, that is what an honest and transparent reckoning looks like to me, because I also think, one learns from history by showing the good and the bad. And if you just celebrate somebody's business success but leave out their war crimes, especially today when we live in an age of such, disinformation all across the board, these families particularly have a responsibility not only to the consumers, but also to history, to be transparent about it.
And you cite, I forget which one it was, but like a young woman now who just recently gave a speech where she's just completely, it's not even like they're trying to hide it anymore. I mean, she's almost like, the past, what does it matter? I'm rich. So and
which is a very troubling indication for where Germany's headed.
Yeah.
I mean, she spoke off the cuff, but I mean, the blatant lack of any historical knowledge
Yeah.
and kind of any sense of morality that Verena Bausen displayed, not only during that speech, but particularly in the follow-up comments that she gave to build the German.
Right, it's a food company. Like they have
it is Bausen. It's a very famous.
Yeah, but there was some shaming and kind of boycotting. It seemed like after her speech. So there's
sure, and I end the book all the way in the back in the notes of sources where she gives this interview in September 2021 to the Süddeutsche Zeitung about how she forces her family to talk about it, and therefore she's forcing them to be more transparent about it, but it's still difficult.
Yeah.
So I mean, I am. I mean, to get back to the previous question, I am hopeful about my generation, even though some show, a blatant lack of knowledge about that period. Particularly those German, and particularly those who end up being the heirs.
Yeah.
Because I do think in the 4.5 years that I lived in Germany, and I know that in the op-ed too, in the essay too, in the New York Times, is that everybody is extremely aware, and is extremely reflective, and is trying to make a better Germany,
Yeah.
and of course with its political and economic might, is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of fascinating things is you described that many of these families have hired historians to uncover the truth about their past, but somehow these histories wind up almost seeming like part of the cover-up in some ways.
Yes.
I mean, they're kind of
unintentionally, in some cases, in most cases, completely unintentionally, and in some intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, you said they're actually kind of good historians often, but then the book comes out and they think they've done everything they need to do, and then nobody,
Well, the historians and their research, I mean, it's also insulting to the historians and their researchers who work on these projects for 3-4 years, and then these studies come out and they are only published in dense academic German, and then nothing changes, and then the findings you can't find anywhere except in like a 1,200-page study in dense academic German, and then it also begs the question: who then exactly is this reckoning with, right? Yeah. Because for the most part, the Germans, of course, were not the victims of the crimes of these patriarchs of these and their businesses.
Right.
So, but surviving forced slave laborers and their heirs never get any access to these details.
Yeah.
So it very much begs the question, and then, when a company or a family then doesn't do anything, it goes to show that they don't. To me, it goes to show that it's not an honest and transparent reckoning that they've initiated.
So your book is about to come out in German also, which is fascinating. So what do you imagine the reaction is going to be? You're going to do a whole book tour there, you said. Like, have you gotten any advanced sense of what the reaction is?
No, I haven't. No. I mean, the book is going to come out. The German translation is going to come out May 5th. I mean, the two translators and the editor and myself worked extremely hard on the German translation to be the best version. The English language version is also great, but to be the even better version of that one. And really worked on it day and night, particularly in December, January, and early March. I got a sense, actually, the man who inspired me to write the book, or gave me the idea of the book, is a German journalist who wrote biographies on the Quandts and the Oetkers. And he actually, I'd send him an advanced copy of the book. And he said, I woke up to this morning with a note from him that he said he read it in one go. And he said, I learned a lot, and it's really well read and really well told, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I mean, in a way, he's my most important critic, since he inspired me to write the book back in 2012, 2013, or gave me the idea that I should write about this topic in a way, not explicitly, but through the interviews I had with him at the time, I got the idea, and in a way, he's my most important critic. So the fact that he approved of it already goes to show I'm also already very happy.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, well, we're out of time, but I want to say thank you so much for sharing your research and telling us about this really important chapter in history. I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming. I want to urge you all to please sign up to be on the YPSA mailing list. This is our last talk for this year, but we'll have many important lectures next year too. And please join me in thanking David de Jong for that great presentation today.
Thank you, Maury. It was my pleasure. It's really nice to be here.
And good luck with.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.